Okay, so welcome everybody, and welcome to this session. This is brought to you by the Northamptonshire Development and Funding Advice Workers Network. Bit of a mouthful, but it brings together a partnership of folk from local infrastructure organisations, local authorities with grant schemes and funders. So just a little information before we get underway. So please remain on mute whilst we go through the session, and do use the chat function to ask any questions or make any comments as we go through the session. As I said, the session's being recorded and will be uploaded to the Northants Council website, where it can be accessible to everybody. At the end of this, there'll be a short questionnaire that you'll receive by email. Now, we know that questionnaires about how did you find the session, with all the best of intentions, often don't get completed. So we're adding a little incentive there. There'll be a John Lewis voucher to be randomly allocated to folk who do complete that. We do like to get a bit of feedback, so please do try and help us there. I'm Sean Silver, and I work and support Kettering Voluntary Network, and I'm employed at Groundwork Northamptonshire and part of that Funders and Advice Workers Network. So we're here for this session to hear about Tudor Trust, and Nikki Lappin has joined us. I'm delighted to welcome you, Nikki. Nikki's going to tell you all about Tudor Trust and then take any questions from you. We're not looking for specific questions about your organisation, so to speak. Those are more for a private conversation. But if you've got questions of a general nature that are going to be of interest to everybody, then we'd be pleased to know them. And as I say, do use the chat function at the bottom to do that. And we'll come to those in the Q&A at the end. It's just a couple more people joining. Nikki, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's nice to be here. I think probably the only good thing about COVID is the fact that we can do more of these, because it's easier to sort of do an hour-long Zoom than to go to. I was in Grimsby last week, and I'll be in Sandwell on Thursday, so I can be in Northamptonshire this week virtually. So yeah, what I'd like to do is try and give you an overview really of the kind of work we fund in our application process, but also maybe give you a little bit of a sense of how we're making grants at the moment, you know, as organisations and the communities that you're supporting still suffering with the impact of coronavirus. So just to give a sense of where things are at the moment. So we're a national grant-making trust, and we have a very wide social welfare focus. And we can support charities and community groups working across the UK. So you don't have to be a registered charity. The basic requirements are that we need you to be constituted, we need you to be doing work that would be classed as charitable, and we need you to have a bank account. So that's the sort of bottom line basics really. And our focus is on supporting smaller scale community-led groups which work with people who are at the margins of society for really whatever reason. And that means in practice that we support a very wide range of organisations working with a very wide range of people. So work with young people, with older people, very sort of community focused work, estate-based work, community centres, that kind of thing, mental health groups, drug and alcohol projects, work with refugees and asylum seekers, domestic violence work. So really a very wide scope. And the focus for us is always on the people. So we're what's often known as a sort of social welfare funder. So we don't have an arts focus, a heritage focus, an environments focus. Sometimes the work we support can use elements of those things within what they're doing, but it's always about the people fundamentally that we are most sort of interested in, really. Been going since 1955, so getting to our older years now. And over that time, we've made around 35,000 grants, totaling around 725 million. Our sort of last official year with our accounts published, which is pre-pandemic, we made 344 grants totaling around 20 million. So that's the sort of range that we normally are in. So as I said, usually looking to fund smaller scale community-led groups with a focus on marginalisation. And we have now an exclusion. We say we won't fund groups with the annual turnover is more than £1 million. In practice, we tend to support at the much smaller end of the scale. So last year, just around 40% of our grants went to groups with a turnover of less than 100,000. So that's the sort of area we tend most often to be in. As I've said, you don't have to be a charity. We can make grants to community interest companies, constituted groups, but we do have to be persuaded that whatever funding we give would be used for a fully charitable purpose. And like most funders, there are some things that we don't fund. So we have some exclusions, like the million plus organisations. They're all listed on our website and in our funding guidelines, and as always, worth checking those before you think of applying. We don't have that many, but there are some. And I think the basic rule is check the guidelines, and if you're not sure, you can give us a ring. We do prioritise taking phone calls. We tend to do phone calls rather than to and fro via email, because it's usually more straightforward to get a quick response, really. So if you read the guidelines, you're not sure about eligibility, then give us a call. We have slightly limited capacity on the phone lines at the moment because everyone's still working from home. But if you leave a message, we always aim to phone back same day. So do leave a message and we'll do our best to get back to you as quickly as we can. In terms of the kind of work we fund, so we don't have set funding programmes, but what we want to do is support the work that organisations themselves most want to do and really prioritise. So in the past, when I started working at Tudor, which was quite a long time ago now, maybe 14 years or so ago, we did have funding priorities. So we had, under community, we'd fund particular types of work. For mental health, we were particularly interested in something specific. Youth, you name it, we had quite sort of strict sort of criteria under various subject areas. And I think our trustees just started to get a sense that we weren't really funding what groups most needed or wanted, but that applicants were trying to sort of slot themselves into our little boxes, which obviously they would do in order to sort of get a grant. So they decided to sort of step away really from sort of setting the agenda, because they felt that local groups would have the best sense of their communities, the sort of challenges and priorities within those communities. So opened up the guidelines to try and make them as flexible as possible. And when we're looking at applications, we talk about looking for a number of key characteristics in the groups that we fund, and that includes a strong focus on marginalisation, organisations which are really sort of embedded in their communities, organisations which listen to and are responsive to their users, and also organisations which offer sort of longer term engagement and support. There's more than that there, and it's all explained in our funding guidelines, so please have a look at those. And we've also done a sort of brief 2-page flyer for this session, which I think Sean will circulate after the session, which just gives you the gist of this. So the sort of basics will be there rather than you having to take notes. I should have said that up front, really. Important point to mention here that when we talk about community, we don't just mean a local area. So a community can also be a community of interest. So a group of people who are linked by a shared identity, a shared experience or challenge. And sometimes it can be a combination of both of those, so sort of geographically focused and community of interest. Because we respond to the needs organisations themselves identify as most important, lots of our grants, in fact, the vast majority, last year around 90%, go towards core costs. So key salaries, general running costs, that kind of thing. We can make other kinds of grants. We do make capital grants. And while we can make project grants, in practice, we're making fewer and fewer of those, probably because we're most interested in providing that support for the whole organisation, but also because we tend to look at sort of longer term engaged sort of funding rather than funding very sort of time limited projects, I guess. There's no official maximum or minimum grant, but being realistic as a national funder, it's really rare for us to make a grant of less than £10,000. It's just not something we tend to do, partly because we think there's others out there who do that, like Awards for All, but partly as a national funder, it just makes sense, I suppose, to focus our resources on the more mid-range side of funding. At the other end of the scale, we're not a sort of lottery level reaching communities type funder. So if you look on our website, we do post our grants lists up there quite regularly. So that gives you a sense of the kind of grants that we make. People often ask about the average grant. Last year, it was about £74,000. In practice, that's not that helpful a figure because that's split across, multi-year grants, capital grants, one-off grants. So it doesn't give you much of a sense of the lie of the land. Whereas looking at the kind of grants list gives you more of a feel for the spread of our grants. And we're happy to consider revenue applications over up to 3 years. We do sometimes fund over longer periods than that, just through one grant, though that is quite unusual. When we've made 5-year grants in the past, it's tended to be with groups we've got quite a sort of a track record with already. But we do fund for longer periods than 3 years because we make, in some cases, continuation grants, so a grant following straight on from previous grant. So it's not unusual for us to fund for 5 years, 6 years, but with a sort of reapplication in the middle of that time. And as well as providing funding, we do try and offer some other forms of support where that would be helpful. So the grants managers at Tudor really try to build a strong relationship with the groups that they're working with, and we really want to know if you're having problems. We can often be flexible about the way a grant's used or provide additional support above and beyond a grant. And that, again, has come particularly to the fore during the last year when many funders sort of signed up to being more flexible because, groups, we realised that groups weren't able to do what they normally did and had to work in different ways, and we wanted to find ways to support that. How to apply? So we introduced an online application process, like most funders probably are now, on the 1st of April, but we've kept it really as simple as we can. So there's a form to fill in that you fill in through our online portal, but beyond that, it's attaching documents. It's not putting everything into a form online. No deadlines. It's a rolling programme, so it's fine to send an application to us at any time. And it is a 2-stage process, and that's really because with an open sort of remit, very open guidelines, we get a lot of applications. So last year we received about 2,500 applications, and we only make around 350 grants a year. So it's roughly 1 in 8 applications that get through to our second stage. So the 2-stage process is designed to really sort of reduce the time and effort that it's spent on an application, because we know we're going to be saying no to a lot of good applications. We don't want people working on a massive bid when, in fact, we're not going to be able to take as many as we'd like forward. So it is quite brief. So the online form is where you give us all the factual information about your organisation. And if you want to see what questions we ask, there's a sort of dummy form on the website that you can look at before you enter the portal, which always sounds a bit Doctor Who. And then there's 3 documents. So we ask 5 questions on a couple of sides of A4, which are very much about you, the work you do, the community you support, the particular sort of strengths and opportunities you see in that community, as well as the challenges. An introductory letter, which is really a good place to tell us about things that don't sit under those questions, sort of set the scene, tell us, give us an update on really sort of live issues that might be affecting you. So it does give you that bit of extra space to use. And most recent accounts. If you're too new to have accounts, then we'd need to see a copy bank statement at that stage, just to show that you were sort of set up and could receive funding. I think one thing that sometimes groups sort of need a bit of a steer on is we do ask a specific question about the sort of the positives within your community as well as the challenges you're facing. That's really because we want to take, where we can, a more, I suppose, what people would often call a more asset-based approach to sort of look at what you're sort of building on, as well as the actual need that you're addressing. So sort of asking that question, as well as asking about the particular difficulties and challenges that you're sort of working with, just helps us to get that sort of balanced sense, I suppose, of your work and of your community. Every application we receive is then assessed by 2 members of staff and a trustee. And we have a weekly assessment meeting where we look at each sort of batch of applications and decide which ones will go through to second stage. And we try and keep things fairly speedy where we can. So at first stage, you should hear from us within a month, whether or not we can take an application forward. And at that point, if we say no, we ask you to wait 12 months before applying again. I think, as always, I would just say, have a good look at our website, have a look at the funding guidelines. The guidelines are worth reading in full. I mean, everything's on the website, but I sometimes think the guidelines just give you that sort of more wraparound sense of what our trustees are particularly looking for. It gives just a bit more sort of background and depth to sort of the particular bits and pieces we're after. So it just gives you probably more of a feel of what we're really looking for. And if in doubt, give us a call. We're always happy to sort of chat anything through that you're not sure about. So if you go through to second stage, you would then be allocated a grants manager who would work with you to develop the application. So at that point, there's no standard form to fill in. It's usually done via a sort of telephone or now a Zoom assessment. In normal times, we might visit, but obviously at the minute, we're not doing that. But as well as things like, budgets and accounts, which we would ask for, we may ask you to write something about specific aspects of your plans, but actually the responsibility will be on the grants manager to sort of write up the conversation that we've had with you, sort of to record that, so our trustees get a good sense of your work and of your plans. We can usually get an application to committee for decision within about 3 months, so we're going to second stage. Can go a bit quicker than that if it's straightforward. It can take longer as well if you need more time to sort of pull things together, or just if you have particular challenges at your end. So we sort of try and be sort of led by your schedule, really. And it's probably important to say at this point that not all applications going to committee for decision get approved. The trustees very much are very engaged. They read all the paperwork. I mean, we do summaries for them, but they also read the initial application, notes of phone calls, all that sort of thing, and then they will ultimately make the decision. If we don't make a grant at second stage, we'll give you detailed feedback telling you why not. I mean, just to give a sense of what's been happening during the coronavirus pandemic, we've been open to applications throughout. So we decided to continue our normal grant making, as well as providing some additional emergency support to the groups we were currently funding. We didn't go to run an emergency fund for groups we weren't already in contact with, because we felt that probably wouldn't sort of play to our strengths, I suppose, as a more relational grant maker rather. But what we did do was give a grant to the National Emergencies Trust for the work they were doing, which obviously that was being distributed through Community Foundation Network. So it was great to be able to sort of contribute to that. So last year we made around 1,000 grants over the year, a lot more than usual. But as I said, a lot of those were sort of emergency grants and top-ups for existing grant holders. I think what we found is a lot of groups have found it quite hard to make an application at the moment, because it's really tricky to write an application when what you're doing is constantly changing and nothing feels very stable, I suppose. So we've tried to give a bit of guidance on that within the application, just to sort of give a sense that, we understand that the way you work will have changed, is likely to change again, all of that. From our point of view, it's really helpful to get a sense of how you're working at the moment. But it's still good for us to get a sense of, what's at the heart of the work you do, what's remained the same in the terms of your values and your approach. But it is a challenge. And again, if you're putting an application together and aren't sure about how to approach that, then again, you can always call us and chat that through if that would be helpful. We're still open to making longer term grants. Our trustees felt it was important to sort of provide that a little bit of a longer term horizon beyond the emergency funding side of things. I mean, a lot of groups we're in touch with at the moment got quite good levels of emergency support during the coronavirus pandemic, but there's been a bit of a cliff edge with that coming to an end, and then trying to sort of sustain themselves in the longer term. The focus on consistency also means that we haven't really changed our guidelines particularly over the last year. We've just really tried to re-emphasise our interest in core funding, our focus on community-driven work, on work that's sort of led by the communities that it's supporting. And as I said, I think that means in practice we're less likely to fund shorter-term projects, really just because it doesn't sit so comfortably within the kind of grant making that we're doing. I think I've been talking for 15, 20 minutes now. I'll just finish off with a few sort of thoughts, really. People often ask, what makes applications stand out? What can I do to sort of make sure that you take an application forward? And I suppose the key thing for us is trying to make sure your application is written by someone who really knows and understands the work that you're doing. We are, really often we'll sort of react to that sort of enthusiasm and passion and energy that comes from an application. To be honest, we don't often go for the most sort of slick or glossy applications. We get quite a lot of queries from people who don't have fundraisers, who are quite anxious about that and worried that will disadvantage them. And in all honesty, it doesn't. Most of the groups we fund are small, don't have a fundraiser. So the person doing the application is often the project worker, one of the trustees. And while we absolutely get the challenges that involves, because this is not somebody's main job, it's hard to sort of fit fundraising around everything else that you're trying to do. It often does just give us that stronger sense of what you're doing than perhaps a sort of more professional, inverted commas, application might. Clarity about what you actually do and how you want to do it. We still occasionally get applications, but it's really hard to understand what you're aiming to do from the application. We're really happy with straightforward human language. You know, it doesn't need to read like an official document. So that, you know, that is something that's helpful to us. And I think similarly, kind of drawing from that, what we find really helpful is where applicants make a case from their sort of own experience rather than purely kind of quoting lots of official statistics. You know, we can look up the index of multiple deprivation ourselves, but what we don't know is how you've discovered from your community what's actually needed. So if you can find a way to tell us, you know, how you know the need is there, what you've done to find that out, that can be really helpful. And I think finally, you know, being very honest about the challenges you're facing. We know nearly every organisation out there is having difficulties at the moment. If you're having a difficult time, you need to know what you're doing to tackle the situation, really. That's something, you know, where we see a group of trustees and staff really is having to sort of rethink what they're doing and really addressing challenges head on. That can be something that makes us want to find out more, really. And finally, I think the most basic thing is probably if you can get someone who isn't closely connected with your work to read an application through, that's a really helpful thing to do, because if they don't get it or there's something they're not sure about, then we might not either. So having that sort of sense check just before you put an application in is often really worth doing. So yeah, that's a bit of a gallop, and I do speak quite quickly, so I apologise, but the nuts and bolts of all this will be in the handout that you'll be getting after this.
Nikki, thank you very much. Well, a very full introduction and presentation about what you're about and what you're doing. Nikki, if you open up the chat, you'll see some questions have been posed on there. And if I just refer to them, the first one that came through was from Tish, who asked, do you offer grants for organisations looking for office space and items?
I mean, we can. I mean, often our core grants will include an element of funding towards rent, you know, and utilities, just the general running costs of an organisation. Occasionally, that might include a little bit of you know, some funding towards capital equipment, you know, sort of furniture, that kind of thing. It'd be rare for us to make a sort of standalone grant just for equipment. That's something we don't tend to do. But if it's something that's wrapped into a wider running cost request, then that could be something that we would look at.
Thank you. And then the next question here is, do you give feedback when an application fails?
We don't at first stage at the moment, which we know is a challenge. So we do at second stage. So if we work with you on an application, take it to trustees and they said no, we will obviously give you detailed feedback at that point, because we've had that sort of quite engaged relationship. We are looking at this because we know that it's the thing that everybody asks for. We obviously will let you know that we haven't taken an application forward, but we don't give individual feedback at the moment. I suppose the challenges for us are the volume of applications. You know, we get 2,500 applications a year, so giving sort of meaningful feedback would be quite resource intensive. But we're investigating. We recently signed up to an initiative run by IVAR, which is the Institute for Voluntary Action Research, with some other funders, and it's about open and trusting grant making. And one of the key things there is to review approaches to feedback. So it is something we're really thinking about, but how we could resource it and also how we could provide useful feedback. I mean, one of the challenges for us is, as a very generalist funder, we're comparing apples and oranges. You know, when we can't. It's not about saying out of 100 applications for this very specific type of work, these 5 were the top. You know, we sort of can't do that. It's more subjective. Yeah. And also there's sometimes internal issues that, you know, nothing to do with the application. We might feel we're overfunding in a particular area. This is not true of Northamptonshire, for example, but historically, like a lot of funders, we did too many grants in London, you know. So over the years, we've been trying to just gradually decrease that. There might be points where we feel we're funding, you know, we funded a lot of work in a particular sector and we just want to rebalance things slightly. So as well as things to do with your application itself, there are also factors to do with our grant making that may mean we're saying no to things. But yeah, it's under review, but at the minute, not something we do.
Okay, the next question, there's a few questions, which is grand. How do you take reserves into account?
We do. We've actually mentioned reserves for the first time in our guidelines this year because we were getting questions about this. We look at them. I suppose there's two things to say. If you have very low reserves, that's not necessarily a problem. We know that's a situation that many groups are in. What we'd say is if your reserve position looks really worrying, that's something just to talk to us about in the covering letter, just to try and give us an understanding of where you are. The other end of the scale, we haven't made many grants recently to organisations with reserves of more than a year. Often our sort of normal range is 6 to 9 months, and that feels quite a sort of comfortable level of reserves for our trustees. We know there's arguments both sides. I think some groups that have got sort of fairly decent reserve levels feel that we're penalising their prudence and the fact that they've been thinking ahead. But I suppose as a grant maker, our sense is particularly at the minute we're looking to support groups where they're really struggling, and it's a prioritisation thing, I guess. But there are occasions where groups have, again, if you've got particularly high reserves, explain that to us in the covering letter, because there are sometimes cases where there's a particular reason for that, and it's just good to know.
Indeed, mitigating commentary. So the next question, would a sports club be eligible for grants where we try to reach out to youngsters from areas of hardship? Physical and mental health benefits of exercise. Funding would enable coaches to be trained and equipment to be purchased.
Yeah. Probably unlikely, to be really honest. We have an exclusion in our guidelines around sports-focused, arts-focused work, unless there's a very strong emphasis on sort of work with marginalised groups. And while we absolutely get, the benefits of sport, physical and mental well-being, of participation and of community building, in practice, I suppose because we're only making a small number of grants a year, we tend to be looking for more sort of targeted interventions. So I'm trying to think where we have funded work with the sports focus, it's tended to be quite specific. So we funded some work, I suppose, with that used football to bring communities together, where it was sort of, local refugee and asylum seeker kind of groups and the local community, but it was quite intense. It was sort of using the sport as a sort of way in, and then doing that sort of youth work and community building through that. Yeah. So it would probably be on the edge, to be honest, of what we'd normally fund.
Okay, thank you. And another one here, are you able to include videos in our applications?
At this stage, not as a matter of course, really because, again, of the volume and the challenge of assessing lots of videos. What we'd say, though, is if for some reason you would struggle, we've had some groups where, whether it's to do with all sorts of issues, whether it's sort of language issues or where people are neurodiverse or, all sorts of things, they would feel more comfortable applying in a different format. We can always talk about that. So if there's something, if you look at an application and think, I'm going to struggle to do that, then, you can always talk to us and we can agree a slightly different approach. And we've done a few video applications for groups where that's been a better approach for them. We've done people who've just recorded something, into their phones, or even someone's dictated something to us over the phone, which, took quite a long time. But, we can accommodate if there's particular reasons to do something in a different way.
Okay. Thank you. Next one, are parish councils able to make an application, an appropriate application?
Yes, parish councils are slightly tricky because we don't, as a rule, fund statutory bodies, and we know that parish councils sort of sit in a slightly unusual place. I think for those, I think we funded a few in the past. It's probably worth a phone call just to talk through exactly what you're looking to do before an application, so we can advise you properly. But certainly we've made grants in the past to parish councils to support, a parish hall, for example, but where there's been a huge, a lot of community activity that sort of sat within our guidelines. So it's possible, but just good to chat that through.
Thank you. Next one. You said an eighth get to second stage. How many in second stage get a grant?
Most, to be entirely honest, I think it's 94-95%, something like that. Not always for the level requested. Sometimes we might get a request for 3 years and end up funding 2, something like that. Occasionally the trustees fund for more than asked, which is always a nice way to go as well. So yeah, if you get through to second stage, you're much more likely than not to ultimately get a grant, but there is just always that possibility that you may not.
Yeah, that's very positive. Right. Okay. Does the exclusion of promotion of religion mean that you won't fund churches or faith groups?
No, not at all. So we fund a lot of churches and faith groups, but for their work with the community. I mean, we know many of the groups we fund that are working with homeless people, for example, or that are doing very, embedded community support work are churches and faith groups. So that's absolutely fine. It's just we can't fund work that has a sort of direct emphasis on evangelization or whatever you want to call it, or sort of active promotion of religion. But if it's about the sort of faith being the driver for the work, that's absolutely something we can look at.
Good. I'm sure that's what the questioner wanted to hear. Would you fund a community play area? It includes play area for children, woodland area, cricket ground, football pitch, fitness area?
Not usually. We have an exclusion around sort of play parks, sort of play areas. Occasionally we've funded adventure playgrounds where there's been it's been about the sort of the youth work again that's happening within that sort of setting. So we wouldn't fund the sort of the capital size usually, but if there's kind of very engaged work going on within that setting, potentially that's something that we could look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And here we have one. I know you say in your guidelines you don't always have to say how much you want initially. Is it still better to have a rough idea in there, or does it really not matter at first stage?
It really doesn't. It's because yes, that is quite unusual, isn't it? We sometimes get phone calls saying, "Where'd you put the amount?" And we don't have a particular box for that. We just say, "How can Tudor best help you?" I mean, people tend to split into two groups. There are people who do have a rough idea. They want a salary for 3 years. They know it's going to come in at roughly 30,000 times 3, and that's fine. If you've got a ballpark sense of where you want to be, then tell us. Other times, people might have a sort of overall, their overall budget, and know they've got a hole of a certain size, and give us a sense of what that shortfall might be. And other times, people really don't put a figure in, and it doesn't affect us at assessment stage. What I'd say though is, if you do put something down at first stage, it's always open to change. Nothing's set in stone. So if we go through to second stage and actually in discussion things change a bit, that's fine. So what ends up going to committee can be a bit different from what came in at the first place.
Okay. Would you fund support of rural bus services that are in danger of removal due to government cuts? And we all know what that brings in terms of access to services.
Yeah. I mean, we absolutely get the issue. I don't think we would. I mean, we currently have an exclusion around community transport schemes, really just because we were, getting lots of applications and we just weren't funding any, and it just felt we were wasting people's time, really. I think our trustees, although things have changed in recent years, there was always that sense of, should a charitable funder be sort of taking on things that, have always been sort of like more the statutory responsibility. And I think transport probably would still fall under that for us.
Thank you. And there's been a great flurry of questions using the chat facility, which has been wonderful. I'll give folk just a last moment to tap away and type another question in, but I think that we've given opportunity for loads of questions to come in, Nikki, and you've responded fully and fulsomely, which is wonderful. So I'm going to look to bring the session to a close. And I know for those of you that are booked into successive sessions, it's not a bad thing to have a break between these sessions. And it is lunchtime, of course. So, Nikki, thanks so much for joining us. It's been great to hear about the great work that, and I know the great projects that Tudor support, and wish everybody here good luck in making application. Just to remind you that this has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Northants Council website for future reference. We will circulate that information sheet that Nikki mentioned to you just now. And do fill in that feedback form, please, and be in with a chance to win the John Lewis voucher. So without any more ado, I'm going to bring the session to a close. Thanks for attending. Nikki, thanks for joining us, and I hope to see many of you again over the next few days. Cheerio, everyone. Bye-bye.